What's going on, y'all? The Marvel Snap devs just made some insane changes to the game. I'm KM Best, and I'm here to break it all down for you. First things first, everyone's favorite purple fart cloud, Alioth, is taking what might be an actually significant nerf here, going from 5 power to 3 power. And I think the reason this is important is because of the amount of potential counterplay that this opens up to the card. Now, you might say, what do you mean, KM? What counterplay does this actually open up? It's still blowing up all my cards on turn 6. That's how it wins games all the time anyway. I lose these games against Alioth because I don't get a turn 6, not because it has 3 power instead of 5. Well, okay, hear me out though. What this does allow you to do is get power into the Alioth lane in ways that actually meaningfully matter. At 5 power, a Doombot would only tie it. At 3 power, a Doombot actually is more points in that lane. In addition, cards like Captain Marvel and Jeff now have reasonable ways to sort of contest that Alioth lane. Jeff specifically is a very, very important one here because Jeff is in, most decks at high elo at this point, and probably most decks not at high elo because I think at this point everyone is like, oh, I really need to buy Jeff. Jeff tying Alioth is a really big deal. In previous iterations of Alioth, the issue was that, okay, let's say there was the location that sends everything everywhere on turn 5, meaning there is an empty location on turn 6, basically guaranteed. Alioth instantly wins that location, and you don't really have a way to get power into there. You can move your Jeff, but you'll still lose to the 5. Now you move your Jeff, and that's a tie. And that's really honestly very important. It's really important that there are meaningful ways of counterplaying this card so it is not just immediately an I win the game button. Doctor Doom, Silk, Captain Marvel, Jeff, Claw even. Like, there are ways to get around this now. If you think you know where the Alioth is going, you can actually make plays on the final turn of the game. And this does it without, actually completely killing the card. I do wonder if, the Jeff interaction specifically is enough to make the card legitimately much worse. But in the event that it is not, Alioth still has the text that it has. If you're playing Galactus, you're still going to play this card. What I'm interested in finding out, though, is exactly what the sort of tempo decks are going to want to do. The Brood deck especially does not really want to play a Doctor Doom in it at the moment because Doctor Doom clogs you even more than your normal game plan clogs you. So I'm interested to see what that happens there. And I should note also, another one of these changes is definitely going to impact the Brood deck. So keep an eye out on that. But the move mid-range deck, right? That plays Alioth as the end game. Will it just go to Doctor Doom? Will it go to Magneto? Are those cards going to be higher percentage in those matchups? Or are they just a little bit too bad compared to the all-consuming purple fart cloud? As someone who doesn't necessarily think Alioth was OP, I think this nerf is still deserved because it was a very unfun way to centralize the metagame. Its play rate was pretty astronomical given that it was a Series 5. It was, I think, played the second most out of any 6-cost card, or not played the second most, included in the second most decks out of any 6-cost card. Only Chavez was higher. And that's pretty wild when you consider that everyone has Chavez and a bunch of decks run Chavez, and Alioth is basically the next one up. So I do think that the centralizing effect it had on the metagame, the sort of deleterious effect it had on gameplay, this was a deserved nerf, and I'm pretty happy with it. I would have gone to 6-4, but 6-3 to enable that specific Jeff tie situation is, I think, a fine way to manage this card. I think they might actually think maybe it's a little bit stronger than I actually think it is. So I'm interested to see what happens with Alioth in the future for sure. You remember how I said one of these nerfs was going to impact the Brood deck? Yeah, it's this one. The Brood deck is having its nut draw power reduced here. Now you are no longer getting 15 power out of Forge Brood. You are instead getting 12, and that's not that much worse, but in the context of it taking up multiple spaces, I think it actually is meaningfully worse. Look at the difference between absorbing manning a brood previously and when it was a 4/5. I mean, that was an amazing play. Now it's a little bit notably worse, and this is the same effect happening, right? Like, you are paying an actual cost for all of your power in the brood deck, and it is that you are very predictable and you have a lot of clearly defined play patterns, and you can only do so much. Now, I do think the brood deck is likely to still be pretty solid, but I am interested in trying Forge and a couple other shells. The first one is Bounce. Obviously, Falcon is a great card with Forge now. Putting a Forge buff onto Kitty Pryde multiple times seems pretty compelling to me, but honestly, just bouncing this guy at all seems pretty compelling to me. He is, at this point, effectively a 1/3 where the target can go wherever, and that's pretty solid rate, especially if you can use that to sort of multiply other things. I'm interested in seeing what happens with Bounce there. I'm also interested, I will say this, in seeing what happens with Phoenix Force, because there are a lot of degenerate Phoenix Force players in my Discord, and I think that this might actually make the deck better. It makes the curve a lot easier. You can just sort of fit it in a lot, and getting the Forge buff onto something like a Human Torch or a Multiple Man, like, you didn't need that extra power all that much. Getting the Forge buff onto Phoenix Force, of course, is phenomenal, right? Like, it wasn't really about the 3 power. It was just about making it a little bit stronger, right? Human Torch is still going to scale up a bunch, right? And so I'm thinking that that might be a very, very safe bet for a good home for this card. What I'm interested in with the Brood deck is, right now, what you're doing when you play that deck is you take the deck and you're like, all right, look, everyone's going to know what I'm doing, but what I'm doing is so strong that I'm going to have a positive win rate anyway. And I'm wondering if this weakness makes the second part of that sentence not true. This nerf might mean that, everyone knows what you're doing, and also you're not strong enough to overcome that all the time anymore. You're going to lose some of those games that you were previously winning. It's a deck built on overwhelming power, and if it's no longer so overwhelming, the premise for playing it sort of falls apart. I am interested to see what happens. I think that it could be a very interesting spot in the meta, because I do think the Brood deck was one of the best decks in the game, and this is definitely a hit to it. But it's also a change that adds some power to other places. And frankly, I think it's a long overdue one, because I don't think anyone particularly liked playing the Brood deck or playing against the Brood deck, where it's just like, did I Forge Brood Absman? Okay, awesome. Did they Forge Brood Absman? Okay, not awesome. So I'm happy they removed the sort of paint by numbers line from the list, and now it's actually a very interesting proposal, I think. A nerf to Shuri in perhaps the least consequential space. Like, this is not a card you ever played for the stats. It's not a card that this kind of nerf will actually matter on for the most part. You are almost entirely playing Shuri for what she does to the next card, and they know that, right? Like, they know this is not like the biggest hit they could do to this card, but it is a hit. I think this is likely to be mostly inconsequential. I don't think a lot changes as a result of this. Most of the time in Shuri lanes, you're either going to win that lane or you're not going to win that lane. And I do think, -1 power in the lane that is the one that they should contest if they want to win the game is an interesting thing to do. And because of the way Shuri plays out, it might be a little more impactful than it appears at first glance, because the way to beat Shuri, as it always has been when they're doing Shuri Red Skull, is you win the Red Skull lane, and then their Taskmaster only wins one other lane. And because they're so committed to the Red Skull lane, if you win that one, all you have to do is put like a perfunctory amount of power in the other lanes, and you will likely win them because of the way Shuri tends to play out. Now, I can tell you where this absolutely will not matter is the Shuri Nimrod decks. They do not care. Like, they do not care about this at all. They were never in the business of caring about this. I can tell you those decks don't care. The Shuri Red Skull decks care like slightly more, but I also still think they don't care. But the only reason that the Shuri Red Skull decks care slightly more is it is now 1 power easier to contest that Red Skull lane. So for whatever for however many games that actually matters. It is going to be a non-zero amount. It's just not going to affect the fundamental game plan of the deck, and likely will not affect its fundamental viability. Next up is a buff to Black Widow, but her text is exactly the same. Why? What's going on here? Well, what's actually happening is they're giving the Widow's Bite that she adds to your opponent's hand -1 power, which is, similar to just making her a 2/2. I'm interested in seeing how that goes. I think putting it on the Widow's Bite is a pretty smart way of doing it, because the Widow's Bite is the part of her that can be legitimately mitigated, right? Like, you can be a deck playing Carnage or whatever, and you Carnage the Widow's Bite away, and suddenly there's like actual counterplay to that part of her. So I do think this is probably the weakest buff that they could have given Black Widow, barring, like a full rework, right? Because if you make her 1 cost, she's Berserk with Falcon. If you make her 2 power, that's a little stronger than this, actually, because of the lack of counterplay to the 2 power versus the potential counterplay to the -1. And I do think that is a pretty compelling thing, because a lot of Black Widow decks tend to be junk decks, right? You're usually either going to play her in a deck that is doing goblin things, or in a deck that is doing, Darkhawk and Ronin things. And so that is typically where she's seen. Although I will note, I don't really play her in Ronin decks. She doesn't do what you want her to do. Like, she doesn't do what Ronin wants you to do. She doesn't actually keep cards in their hand, because they play out the 0 cost card and then they don't draw a card that turn. So, but Darkhawk stuff and Goblin stuff tend to be where she is. One interesting note, I would say, is that, recently there has been a Darkhawk Goblin type deck, and it has been the, Ravonna Renslayer type deck. And I guess it's worth noting that this Black Widow, since she did not get moved to 2 power, it works with Ravonna Renslayer. So there's something to be said about that, I think. We got Black Widow, we got Green Goblin, we got Hobgoblin, we got Darkhawk, we got Mystique. There might be something there. I'm interested to see if that ends up being a thing. And I do think that Black Widow, seeing a buff, is an interesting way of adding disruptive tools in a metagame that seems very built on drawing specific cards in a specific order. So I'm actually pretty optimistic on Black Widow. I'm not saying she's going to be like great, but she's going to be like a pretty solid card, I think. Like, definitely more of a reasonable play than she was in her previous form. So I'm happy they did this buff, because I do consider it the weakest possible buff, and I definitely don't want her to be like a super meta card. I feel like a meta full of Black Widows would be absolutely miserable. And so I'm glad they picked basically the weakest thing they could do to make her a little bit better. Finally, a buff to a Series 1 favorite, that is White Tiger. And White Tiger now, instead of making a 7 power Tiger Spirit, is going to make an 8 power Tiger Spirit. And yeah, I love that. I'm actually just kind of a huge fan of that. I think it's a kind of like an underrated card now. I think it'll be an underrated card, right? Like, you think of it basically as, it's a little bit like Claw now. I think it could stand to get another power, right? Like, you think about Claw. Claw is like a 5/10 effectively across 2 lanes. This is much more, limited. It's definitely a much more limited card, because it is not actually splitting across 2 lanes. It's not actually threatening 2 lanes. If you play a Claw, you can get value out of the 4 power and the 6 power. If you're playing this, you're probably not getting a lot out of the 1. So I do think when you compare it to its ongoing counterpart, I guess you would say, it is probably still coming up short. And I always sort of wonder about the viability of Wong decks. Like, what if we just straight up played a Wong deck and we're just like, look, Cosmo's not real, White Tiger's going everywhere. It'll be totally awesome. I don't necessarily think that's true, but I do think this might make people think about that a lot more. And I gotta say, there really have not been a lot of Cosmos in the metagame right now. And I maybe just the push towards that, the idea that it could be good, maybe that is enough to maybe shake the metagame up a little bit. Because, like, I really do sometimes think, like, okay, what would be good right now is just like an autopilot on reveal deck where I just go like Ironheart, Wong, White Tiger, Odin, game over. But of course, Alioth exists, so it's pretty hard to actually do something that autopilot. I don't think that it's going to be better than Claw. Claw's a card that actually sees play in legitimate decks sometimes, a great juke because you know where it is going to go. I don't think this card reaches that level, and I don't think that its archetype can survive the existence of Cosmo and Alioth. And so I think mostly this one is a wash for everyone except Pool 1 players. Pool 1 players, I think previously there were like very clearly defined best things to do in Pool 1. I wonder if this actually makes on reveal type stuff a better archetype in the Pool 1 meta. I remember when I played Twitch Rivals, I didn't even consider on reveal as a reasonable thing for my opponent to bring. I was pretty sure it was just going to be like Dino, Zoo, and ongoing decks, and I definitely did not play against any on reveal decks when they had the Pool 1, Pool 2 challenge. So I do think that it'll be interesting to see how that shakes up the early Pool 1 meta, Pool 1 and Pool 2 meta. It's definitely a better card than most, I think, at that point, but we'll have to wait and see on that. As far as competitive, I don't think it does much. So overall, I'm happy with what they did do in the patch. I am undeniably happy. I'm especially happy about the Alioth one because it was getting a little samey, but there are two cards I wonder if they're reaching nerf tier, and they are Mobius M, Mobius, and Loki. And I think the reason I bring both of them up, originally I was just going to record this segment on Mobius, but I realized, if you nerf Mobius, Loki's just going to come back in force, right? Like, Mobius in every deck is kind of what's keeping that deck down. If it even is being kept down, I still believe it to be one of the best decks in the game. And I just sort of wonder if they're in a position where, we can't nerf Mobius because, it's better to have that be popular than it is to have Loki run wild again. And at least, Mobius is like cheaper and more splashable and does other things. And so I guess that makes Mobius a little more fair. Do look out for a video from me in the future about Mobius specifically. I think I'm going to do another one of those great debate videos where we really get into the nitty-gritty of Mobius and Mobius, his effect on the metagame, and whether or not he should be nerfed. But him not being in this is something that I did notice. Moving him to 3, I mean, maybe a Silver Surfer deck would take advantage, but I think he'd be a lot less splashable, and maybe that's not the goal they have for the card. I don't exactly know, but it's definitely the thing that sort of made me make, when you walk up to an enemy in a Pokemon game and the little exclamation mark appears above their head, it kind of made me do that. It was like, oh, okay, sure. All right, y'all, that's going to be all from me. As always, I've been Cam Best. Remember to like, subscribe, do all the things that really help me out. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been Cam Best. You be good. I will see you in the next one.